Happy Earth Day, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my usual webinar co-hosts, David Keith and Sara Hastings-Simon. Climate and energy debates rest on predictions. Now, I'm personally not a futurist. Generally, when I make predictions, they are wrong. And I'll say for our Canadian audience, especially with anything to do with pipelines, but at least I'm not alone in getting things wrong. I grew up in Ontario where supposedly because of power plants using nuclear fission, we wouldn't have to meter electricity. Didn't exactly turn out that way. So predictions are notoriously fallible, and Canadian scientist Václav Smil put it years ago, energy forecasts are not worth even the cost of the cheapest acid paper on which they get printed. Yet, in spite of their notorious fallibility, on a daily basis, I know in the policy work I do, I rely on predictions that are derived, in part, on climate and energy system models. So today, we're going to dive into that world. We're going to try to parse imponderables to come up with plausible predictions through modeling and understand how that's done. So to help us do that, we have enlisted one of the world's most influential climate scientists, Ken Caldeira. And it's not just us saying he is one of the world's most influential climate scientists. Ken is on Reuters' hot list of the world's most influential climate scientists, as is our own David Keith, by the way. A really interesting profile of Ken just went up on Reuters.com today. We've tweeted out a link, but I highly recommend you check it out because the short intro that I give here will not do any kind of justice to the depth and breadth of Ken's career. And it's a really interesting read. So by day, Ken is an atmospheric scientist who works at the Carnegie Institution for Science's Department of Global Ecology. He's also with Breakthrough Energy, a group dedicated to helping humanity avoid a climate disaster. By night, he is, among other things, a longtime bass player who jams with fellow scientists. So welcome to Energy versus Climate, Ken Caldeira.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Ed.
Great. Looking forward to our conversation. The usual housekeeping notes, we're going to have a chat amongst the four of us till about 35 minutes after the hour. Then we'll get to your questions. For questions, send them in via the Q&A box. Please don't use the raise hand function or chat box. And then the wonderful Mika McFarlane in DC. Hello again, Mika. Welcome back. We'll screen for your questions, and I'll also look for live questioners as well. And if you're not interested, just tell them no. So let's start, Ken, with the basics. And the basic being, and as I say, I'm a policy practitioner. I use the results of climate energy system models. I'm not involved in producing them. Very simple question. What is the difference between a climate model and an energy system model?
First of all, I think for many of these questions, David will be as adept at answering them as I am, if not more so. But a climate model basically tries to represent the laws of physics in a computational framework, and where most of the underlying science, there's some uncertain science, but most of the parameters and so on, people generally agree on, or at least agree on some uncertainty range. And you're basically just trying to predict the evolution of a physical system. And for the most climate modeling, the human component, in other words, what are our emissions, what will our land use change be, is prescribed as part of a scenario to the climate model, and the climate model is predicting the physical consequences of these human actions. And typically the variables in a climate model will be things like temperature, maybe wind speed, humidity, these kinds of physical parameters. An energy system model, many of the parameters in the model are energy, but also dollars is typically an important variable in an energy system model. And this economic value is typically not part of climate models. Further, climate model projections depend on physical parameters that typically do not change in time. So the gravitational constant will be the same in 2100 as it is today, Whereas energy system models often are looking for low cost or least cost solutions to different problems. And so projections of future costs become a key parameter in model projections. So my sense, having worked mostly with climate models, but more recently with energy system models, that differences in energy system model results are very often tied to just differences in assumptions regarding costs or what people will be willing to do. Whereas difference in climate model projections are often due to some subtlety of some physical parameterization or some nuance of how the model is designed. And so, so if I was to try to summarize, I would say that climate models are models of physical systems that project consequences of human actions. Energy system models try to predict or project what low-cost futures might look like that depend in a fundamental way on what people decide to do.
Great.
One useful thing to say is that climate models are almost the same as the models used for weather forecasts. In some cases, they're really mostly the same model code working in mostly the same way. There are little differences, but they're very close to the same thing. So part of the enormous improvement that many of you will have seen in weather forecasts over sort of 50 years or decades is sort of related to the increasing fidelity of those models. And
there's an analog with energy system models in that, people do run models of the electricity grid or, operators of dams or different facilities have to make projections about what the prices of electricity will be in the near term. And so they're running something often similar to a weather model, except for an energy system. But the difference is that as I said before, in physical models, the gravitational constant is not going to change over the next century, but the price of solar power or the cost of batteries will change. And so for these short-term energy system projections, you don't need to take into account these changing costs. But when you're starting making multi-decadal projections, it's largely based on people's projections of costs. In fact, I was trying to get a postdoc to do a study where we basically collect a whole bunch of energy system models and just try to predict the outcomes of the model from their cost assumptions without looking at anything about their model details. And I have a feeling that you'll be able to predict something like 90% of the difference in the model results based on their cost assumptions. Whereas I think you'd be less able to predict what a climate model does based on differences in parameter assumptions.
Well, one way to flip it around is when I would sometimes debate the Calgary-based Friends of Science, who were, of course, anything but an Orwellian phrase, who were the deniers of science. They would, they're very sure that we've all faked it and there's no real climate response to CO2. And one of the things I would say is, you got a bunch of rich oil patch friends. If you're so sure, hire a bunch of mathematicians to write you a climate model. It's not that hard to do that obeys the laws of physics and shows no response to CO2. And that'd be really an impressive thing. And the answer is right now, we don't know how to do that. These climate models, there isn't that much freedom. There are ones that have less and more response to CO2, but it's not like you don't code in the response to CO2. You code in a bunch of physically observed stuff and you get out the response to CO2. And the fact that nobody can produce one that has, say, no responsiveness to CO2 says something deep about the science. Whereas energy system model, I could produce an energy system model that really does just about anything because so much is determined by the input assumptions.
Yeah. Sorry, if I could just jump in. Am I right in thinking that when we talk about climate models and energy system models and the differences, so climate models, we understand the science, and my understanding is the science has been pretty stable. I mean, there's a great reference in an Australian mining journal from like 1912, worrying about combusting coal and all the GHGs that will put in the atmosphere and saying, this could be a problem in the centuries to come. The New York Times, I understand, and I think, David, I've heard you say this, first ran an article getting the science roughly right in the early 1950s. first report getting the science right was in the Johnson administration era. And that's been relatively stable, my impression. Energy system models are notoriously inaccurate. If you look at some of the models, say from the 70s, and not to pick on him, but to pick on Amory Lovins, who would say, hey, by now we'd all be powering our homes through entirely by distributed renewable energy. So is that a right generalization? The climate science and the models are more stable than the energy system models.
Again, I don't think it's the model. I think it's the assumption. So when Amory Lovin says, that something is going to be the cheapest and it's going to win through market forces, that's because he's projecting that thing will not cost very much. And then you run it through a model and it dominates the model. But the real driver of that was the assumption that whatever the favored technology would be low cost. So that I see this, sometimes we'll publish some result and somebody will say, oh, well, Caldeira's model says this. And it's like, well, it's what assumptions we made led to this conclusion. You can think of an energy system model. I mean, all models are this, but basically they're just engines that tell you logical consequences of your assumptions. And that's true of both climate models and energy system models. But with climate models, the logical consequences of your assumptions, first of all, the assumptions are, since they're not changing in time, right? Again, the gravitational constant, different other physical constants stay constant in time. And so we can do empirical studies to understand what's the extinction coefficient, how much long wave radiation does CO2 absorb. We can do experiments and narrow uncertainties. And then we're confident that that absorption by CO2 will be the same in year 2100 or 2200 as it is today. And whereas the drivers for energy transition models are often cost projections, and where there's no experiment that you can do to narrow differences, or at least no obvious experiment. And so, so I think the good way to think of models is telling you logical consequences of assumptions, and that it's really the assumptions driving differences, especially in the energy system transition models.
And I just wanted to add on one thing. So Ken and David, you've both talked about the cost as a key assumption on the energy system models. And I think that's obviously a big piece of it. But I think it goes beyond that, because whereas in the climate models, we have a pretty good understanding of the physical rules that govern, the things that are happening within those models. We don't have, a very good understanding of the underlying rules that govern, people, which are a really important part of the energy system model. And so, cost is one element, of course, of what drives energy systems. But I would just add that there's also the political system behind it, and all kinds of decisions we make as either rational or irrational people that are part of our energy system.
Yes, this is one of the big things in energy transition modeling. And I'm saying energy transition modeling, talking about multi-decadal things as opposed to how things working this year. That there's a big distinction between possible and feasible or practical in the real world. So often someone will run a model and, people are using their electric cars as batteries, and everybody loves nuclear power, and people don't worry so much about cost because they're trying to just deal with the climate problem. And then you can be in other conversations and say, well, are people, if they need to drive home that day, are they really going to feel comfortable letting people take electricity out of their car? Would they let people take gasoline out of their car? And, will people, if nuclear power is lower cost, will people accept it because they want the lower electricity bills, or do they still be going to be anti-nuclear? And so that these kinds of assumptions about how complex social systems will respond and how complex people will respond are often central to to people's model results, because they're making different assumptions about people's behavior.
So I think we may have lost our typical host here with Ed. Unfortunately, he's having some internet stability problems. So we're going a little bit rogue here on energy versus climate. So I'm going to take over, but surely not as capably as Ed usually does. But I think what we'll do to start before we move into the next question is actually start with a poll. So if we can bring that up. So we know that there's been a lot of talk about targets. Is targets the right thing to be focused on, or is it policies? But we did want to kind of start off the energy policy discussion space or the energy modeling space with a question about where we think the actual reductions in the US emissions will be. And so while folks are filling that out, then I will turn to some questions around energy models. The big question that we ask of energy models are things like, what will emissions be in 2050 if we don't make new policies, or how quickly will emissions go down given some specific policy? So maybe turning to you, Ken and David, to start off, what do past energy forecasts tell us about the predictive power of these kinds of energy models, and how can we really use them constructively? Should we use them? Should we just throw them out and say, models are wrong, so there's no point? So Ken, maybe I'll turn it to you, and then David, and then I'll chime in.
As with many of these things, your assessment of the skill is relevant relative to what your expectation is, and what do you expect these models to do. And I've written some things and received criticism for it, where basically I just took historical trends and projected them forward, saying, well, look, the past is the best predictor of the future, and let's just extend past trends forward. And those kind of works pretty much get soundly knocked by people who do more thoughtful projections. And that basically emissions are lower than you would project based on sort of century or half century scale trends in carbon intensity and so on. And so if the metric is, do the projections do better than just assuming that the future will be like the past? The answer is they do better, I think. I think that's the evidence. But, the question is how much better?
So that's interesting. If you think about global carbon emissions, it seems to me that from the beginning of the kind of IPCC era, when we had the high fossil A1F or whatever it was called, in practice, actual emissions have, it's so hard to tell because what's the universe you're sounding from? I want to say actual emissions have come a lot closer to those old business as usual over the last 20 some years than they have to some of the more optimistic projections.
Yeah, but the old business as usual was actually lower emissions. Like if you just project out half century scale projections, it was more or less exponential, and you do those same rates of growth forward. They are above RCP 8.5, which anybody who follows Twitter knows that that's like you can have a major discussion about that's plausibility. But so even those early projections were lower than just continuation of the past. But I think this raises an issue of motivated reasoning, and that we're all human beings, and we're more naturally accepting things that are supportive of our prior beliefs, and we're more skeptical of things that are inconsistent with our prior beliefs. And so, if we really believe that solar is going to get much cheaper, and that batteries are going to get cheap, and however we came to this belief, and then there's so many different projections out there that when we run our model, we find some cases where they're projecting that batteries will get cheap and solar gets cheap, and we'll run our model with that, and we can cite that paper. And then somebody who doesn't share that worldview might use some other set of assumptions. And so I think there's a real problem in sort of everybody running a model and coming up with results that confirms their priors.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I mean, one way to see this is places where in the real world people pay money for projections. So for weather forecasting, projections really matter, and there's real money in it. And also for kind of a half year ahead or year ahead climate forecasts are just beginning to be skill, and they matter for agricultural futures markets, and you can see how much they matter because people trade on them. And I think one way to think about this is if the people who do kind of academic energy transition models really knew how to accurately project what the costs of these various technologies, how they would evolve over the next decade, then I think they'd be in huge demand in Wall Street because they'd be able to confidently predict which companies would win and lose.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you don't see Wall Street battering down the walls of academic energy modelers is a sign that the predictive skill is pretty weak.
Right. No, if we had real skill, you could become rich investing in the market, which
because I mean, just to tell, maybe I didn't tell that story right, because you did see one of the really exciting things in the climate modeling world is, for example, when these El Nino forecasts began to have some skill, and the skill wasn't very good, it was like 20%, but they began to have some skill. I remember talking to some people who first developed these models. They got calls from futures traders who began to realize they had skill and they could use it. And yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. My brother lives in Fiji, and for some crops, they're deciding when to plant and what crops to plant depending on El Nino forecast. So it's affecting, our peasant type, small landholder agriculturists in Fiji. So yeah, these things have real effects.
So this is the voice of the normal moderator. Am I coming through?
Yes,
you are, Ed.
Wonderful. I'll keep my video off. So I've been listening in. Tell us, what is the value of energy system models? If they can be gamed, if it really depends on the assumptions, they can be hijacked for political purposes. Like, what value do they create for the world right now?
I think they force you to put all your assumptions on the table and state them clearly. And, so if you are making a model that, uses only solar and wind, and you're trying to meet electricity demand, you have to show how you're going to bridge that gap between demand. And you can't just wave your arms. You have to actually have something explicitly in the model.
I think maybe a really useful lesson I think that users of models should think about is I think we look too much at the output of models in the kind of public debate. And as Ken said, it's really the inputs, the assumptions that drive. And I think Ken's right that in principle, in the academic world, the good thing about models is they force you to write down all your assumptions. In practice, what we get in the energy debates is models are released with a big fanfare. The debate is just about the output. And really, for me as an academic, I will tell my students or other people working, I don't even want to see the output until I've seen the assumptions. And I'll critique the assumptions first, and then I'll look at the output. And I think we need to encourage a dialogue where people put those assumptions down first, and where you can critique and discuss the assumptions, because those are the key political decisions.
And
I see this in social media where people criticize models based on the model output.
Yeah.
And it's I don't like the conclusions. It's like going to a doctor and getting a bad diagnosis and saying, I don't like that doctor. Let me find a doctor that will tell me I'm healthy. One of the things that climate modelers did to help get around this problem was have model intercomparison projects. And so there are projects where the modelers are said, at least for the social and political type assumptions, that look, here's scenarios of these assumptions. Now you all go and project out what the consequences of that would be. And we ran a little, there's this class of simple energy system model known as macro energy model. And we ran one of my postdocs ran a little intercomparison project of 4 of these models, and where we agreed on the costs and everything, and then just ran the exact same thing. And even with these simple models, people were handling discounting of money differently? Like, did you consider that a dollar in July is worth different than a dollar in January? When I gave you the battery, was the battery charged or uncharged? There's little subtle differences that can accumulate into significant differences. And so I would think something like the CMIP Climate Model into Comparison project, where you have, the models try to run some standard scenarios where everybody has the same costs. And then you also maybe could have, one model where they're running the same model with a bunch of different people's cost assumptions. The other thing, we're talking mostly about electricity here. Most energy use is not electricity. And this whole question of how to bring in, we're making cement and we're making steel and doing all kinds of other things, and, how to integrate all of those things. Electricity is really nice because it's a little bit like money, or, it's the same wherever it is, whereas a lot of other things of value, it depends anyway, can be hard to measure and so on.
Great. Sara, I know you have a comment, and then I'd like to take advantage of the fact that both you, Ken, and David advised Bill Gates in the lead up to his recent book. So, but Sara, jump in.
Yes, so on this question of how, are models useful and how should we use them? I think right now they are being used in political discussions often in unhelpful ways, right? So to go back to, what is a model? When we talk about the things that come out of models, what are those? Are those forecasts, are scenarios? And one of the trends in modeling from, some of the energy projection agencies over the past years has really been a move towards these scenarios, which is saying, look, we're not going to try to predict exactly what is definitely going to happen in the future, but based on a set of assumptions or different sets of assumptions, so different sort of scenarios, this is what the world could look like. And that, I think, is something, that's very useful to be able to kind of do, I think, what you guys were talking about of, let's lay your assumptions out on the table. The problem is that the way that I see those being used within the debate are not at all that. It's much more of a, pick your favorite outcome, and that's the way the world looks, and these other ones are wrong. And so I think that models can be very useful when they're used in a sense of, okay, we're trying to, as a politician or policymaker, we're trying to plan for the future. And so we want to know what the range of potential futures are and test our, policies, be they emission reduction policies or just, economic policies, frankly, around what the potential future could look like. And that's a really useful way to use models. That's not necessarily what's being done. And I think the one other observation or point that I wanted to make is that I think we also still very much in modeling have this bias towards not seeing more extreme changes come out of the models. And, some of that is even in the way that models, and here I'm talking really about energy system models, the way that they are calibrated and the sort of bias towards things staying more the same. And you can see that even in short term. So, I think it was LBNL's they recently released the cost reduction results of wind, I think it was, over the past 5 years. And even in this very short term and very narrow question around, how much will wind technology costs come down over 5 years, the actual observed results were more than, the range of options that were. This case is maybe more of a prediction than a model, but predicted by experts within the space. And so I think, we need to do a better job within the political sphere of discussing the output scenarios for what they are, a range of outcomes that we test our, political plans against and make sure that they are robust against, but also acknowledge that, we seem to time and time again underestimate the pace of change. And, maybe we can't quite fix that in our models for now, but we should at least be aware of that when we're considering, the likelihood in the range of scenarios.
Yeah, it's a good point, Sara. And it seems that we create policy based on bold and fearless predictions of what the energy future will look like, or the energy future we hope for. And thinking of the new Paris commitments that both the US and Canada made today, taking existing ambitious targets and now just doubling down on them on the Canadian target. And I know a bunch of folks in Ottawa will probably send me heated emails after this. I have no idea if we're a 30% GHG reduction target by 2030 over 2005 levels was tough enough. Now at 45%, we're going to be pulling GHG emission reductions out of the couch to get there. I don't know how we get there, but you're right. We don't test them against scenarios the way that companies do. And, Shell and under Jeremy Bentham and the scenarios team there have been producing, I think, pretty good scenarios for the past pretty much 40 years, or the Rand Corporation. But I want to take a detour and now talk about educating Bill. And now for something not completely different, but a little different. So Ken and David, you were both advisors to Bill Gates for close to a decade. And David, if I have the stat right, I think you once said that you'd been part of something like 25 5-hour briefings. To be clear,
I don't think either of us wanted to be called or were advisors. We ran these learning sessions that we were asked to run. But I think actually it's a really important distinction. I'll let Ken jump in.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't think I ever say I would never say, Bill, you should do this. I think he's a smart guy, and I would just try to give him information and assume that he can make up his own mind.
All right, my knuckles duly wrapped. You are not advisors. You are learning session facilitators. But you did a whole bunch of them over, I think, 9 years that helped inform, but not advise, his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And in that book, he writes early on, I can't deny being a rich guy with an opinion. I do believe, though, that it is an informed opinion, and I'm always trying to learn more. So just maybe give us a sense, like, how did you help him to learn more?
Do you want to go for it, Dave?
Sure. I mean, I guess what I found really amazing was how much homework got done and how focused he was. And I think of that a little bit in relation to what I see in government. So I think rich guys have too much power for sure. I'd like to see less of them. But what I saw was the level of focus is really being unlike anything I see in interacting with folks in government typically. So when we'd run one of these meetings, we'd often give him many hundreds to kind of 1,000 pages of background reading. The meetings, he always had, and every single one had clearly done the reading. The conversation was kind of 100% focused in a way where I just felt like I was impressed there would be close to zero small talk in kind of 5-hour meetings. And I think he was good both using Ken and I and using other groups to get a really big range of opinions. And what I felt was that it's the way that governments typically get organized. Senior people don't do that kind of focus dive. So, one that I ran with him was for nuclear fusion not that long ago. I happened to be the one who ran that and brought together a really interesting range of people to really debate what was plausible and not plausible and trade us to different technologies. And I felt like, man, I wish that somebody inside, some big governments had been able to do that level of deep dive that I don't think they're doing enough of. So my experience was just how kind of amazingly serious he was at doing reading and research before giving opinions.
Yeah, I'm basically on board with what David just said. I mean, for a number of things. I mean, I was organized anti-nuclear weapons demonstrations and then wrote a conference paper with Edward Teller. And so, I'm definitely think that the lack of equitable income distribution in this country and in the world is one of the key problems facing our society that needs to be rectified. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I do think that Bill Gates is an outlier in that, I think when he's allocating resources to address a problem, he's very efficient in his resource allocation. And so while I might, wish that there were better tax laws, here's a person who I believe is genuinely wanting to do good in the world and has resources to do good. And if I'm in a position that I can help him do that more effectively, I feel that that's the path right now that I can have the most positive influence. And yeah, it would be great if the government were doing a much better job on promoting cost-saving energy innovation. And maybe they will in a few years, but right now I feel this is a way I can contribute.
Yeah. So I think it's intuitively a good thing. And sure, I mean, full props to Bill for the amount of time that he spent doing a deep dive to get up to speed on our climate and energy challenges. Maybe Sara, turning to you, like, should we be concerned, or what, not should we, what are the concerns around billionaire philanthropists like Bill Gates increasingly funding climate research or influencing climate and energy policy, as he is clearly attempting to do through this book?
So I think there's a couple of things that I'm concerned around. I mean, one is, just where are the biases or blind spots that, any individual, and obviously this is someone who's well-informed and has taken the time to be well-informed, and, certainly is spending his money in ways that I think are better than what, Charles Koch is doing. So, credit where credit is due for that. But I think still, there are a number of blind spots that do come up. I think one of the things that I found interesting, so I went back to and reread the op-ed that he wrote in the Globe a couple months back about, what governments should do to fight climate, and this idea that, he has embraced more the role of policy, which I think is great. And I found myself, nodding along on a lot of what governments should do. But I think that the big disconnect is like, how do you actually get governments to do those things? And where I think there is a gap in kind of the approach that Gates is taking is that understanding necessarily of, where the political power and frankly, the kind of company power that is pushing the other directions on some of these things comes from. And I thought it was kind of telling, actually. I feel like he almost told on himself a little bit in the op-ed when he was saying that when he was at Microsoft, that they tried to, avoid government intervention in their business, right? And obviously, I think there's some evidence that part of the reason that he was able to amass some of that wealth, had to do with power that the company had in ways that some people say are questionable. And so I think that, to me, that's really, if I boil it down, that's, aside from all of the other issues that were brought up, that's really the crux of it, is like whether people that have created this massive wealth in part from an unequal system that allowed massive influence from a small number of individuals have this blind spot in exactly part of the solution that's needed for the problem. Because I do think, coming back to like David, your point of, that you need to have decision makers that are well informed and really deep in the details. To me, that's a really important part of the industrial policy that we need to move forwards on these challenges. I just think that, why wasn't number 7 on his list? We should have massive tax reform and massive reform of, the powers that corporations hold to drive that.
So, first of all, I'm not on the political side of things. I'm on the technical side of things. But it is interesting sort of being somewhat on the inside and then reading the reviews, because reviewers use language like blind spot or something he overlooked. And they don't stop and think that, well, maybe they thought deeply about this and maybe it was a strategic decision.
What do you mean by that, Ken? What do you mean?
Well, that there's you can think of politics as portfolio. So when there was Elizabeth Colbert wrote a really nice 2006 piece in the New Yorker called "The Darkening Sea," and it recounts a story where I, in front of some congressmen, called for an emissions target, a zero emissions target, and I did that in 2005 to Jay Inslee and several other representatives, and they laughed at me when I said that we should bring emissions to zero, because it seemed so out of the political frame of plausibility. And now here we are in 2021, and zero by 2050 is kind of a mantra that everybody says, including Jay Inslee, who was in that meeting. And so there's times to widen the Overton window, and then there's other people who are trying to actually pass policy and get things through Congress. And if you're trying to get legislation passed through the Senate, you need to have Republican senators. If you think it needs 60 votes, you need to have Republican senators on board. And so when you say, oh, what do you have to do to actually get things done in the real world? Well, what you actually have to do to get things done in the real world is get 60 Senate votes, including votes from people who voted to acquit Trump. And so, I think it's useful to think about what is real substantive climate legislation that could get through Congress that can get votes from some of the people who voted to acquit Trump.
Yeah, good point.
Is that actually possible, or is it?
Right, no, but if
that's
what you're trying to do, then you have to be much strategic and not just say things that please the Twitterati.
All right. If I'm coming through, we'd like to turn to questions. And Charles Seiler, you're up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, we can. Go ahead, Charles. Welcome.
Thank you. What is the single biggest question we're waiting for models to answer as a precursor to reducing emissions? To what extent, after all the modeling we've done, do we already know what we need to know in order to take stronger action on cutting emissions? Thank you.
All right. Good question, Charles. Who wants to jump in?
I basically think it's going to be a learning, this is a learning by doing under uncertainty and with, revisions to strategies thing. So I think we don't need to know anything more from models to get going.
Yeah, I think for climate, I think climate models tell us, agreed. I don't think there's anything more we need to know about climate to tell us we ought to be doing more to cut emissions. I think there are things we'd like to know from energy system models to tell us about how to allocate our efforts inside the bucket of cutting emissions. So to me, there's no question we have to cut emissions, but there are real choices about how much effort you put into EV charging stations versus steel making versus carbon removal versus energy efficiency rebates. And those things, you don't have the political capital to do them all, and they really will have different effects. And that's where I think the energy system models really matter.
And I would add another cut on that. I agree with both those points strongly. I think then, David, within those areas where energy system models can help, I think it's on certain questions. So, I would point to the electricity sector where, we know pretty well what to do to get fairly highly decarbonized, and the exact percentage will depend where you're at and all these things without having to pour a lot more money into it. And then we're going to need to do some modeling to understand the best pathways to get that last 20%. And so that's where, again, I think that if you come back to the political discussion, we get trapped in this sort of, should we deploy or innovate, should we plan or move forward? And it's, we need to be doing both. And we need to differentiate between the things that we know how to do that we can go and do now and the things that we still have to, work towards and think about more.
Sure. I'd give a shout out to the government of Canada on its last budget, because I think it's paying attention to the models. And if you look at this budget, it wasn't full of the type of green bling that you've called out in the past, David.
I don't know. I looked through it and I felt that the gap between that and what I would imagine being sound policy was pretty huge. Like there was stuff about coastal fisheries and salmon farming. There were all sorts of things that seemed kind of potentially interesting environmentally, but pretty disconnected from climate action. I didn't feel that, but I'm not an expert. But I'd say I did look through the whole doc, and just the high level list looked very different from the list I personally would make up if it was my job to try and drive emissions down fast.
So, to be clear, there are lots of goodies in there, not on the climate side, but compared to past exercises, this was really going after heavy industry. This was going after big megatons and not some of the green bling, as you call it, that doesn't really add up to big reductions. So I would give them a shout out. And I think that comes from talking to good modelers, and we had and thinkers just like Mark Jackard and Navius, like what we had Mark on the show in January. But let's get to a couple more questions. Both Ken and I'm just picking one right off the top here. Both Ken and David were rather negative about energy system models. What needs to be done to make these models better? Thank you, Richard Toll. What needs to be done to make them better?
First of all, I'm spending much of my time these days working on these models. So but I'm working on them as a conceptual tool to help understand, basic conceptual issues and not trying to come up with quantitative results. I looked at a paper the other day And again, I go to the assumptions and you go to the supporting material, and they have like 20 different technologies for 10 different time periods. And there's like table after table of pages of numerical assumptions that you have no way how. And so I actually think that some kind of model into comparison project where there's some place you can go that will say, here's the key assumptions that's explaining why different groups are getting different results, because nobody has time to dig through pages of supporting material. So I almost think a model into comparison project and then almost a user's guide to energy system models.
And I think in some kind of open source way to compare assumptions transparently, because as Ken says, assumptions drive a lot of the outputs. And Ken's been involved a little bit of this. A former student of mine, Jordan Carolus, has been involved in trying to start a kind of more open source energy modeling system. And I think that with really a change to kind of thinking about how these things are documented so that it's very easy in an efficient and automated way to compare assumptions, I think would help a lot. And I think the other thing actually I wanted to bring up that sort of relation to the question of like the question of the day, which is very short 2030 targets. I think one systematic problem is that the kind of model that you build, if you're trying to build for a 50 or 100-year model, where typically costs and amounts kind of respond in real time is appropriate, but it's not appropriate when you're trying to model a very fast transition like 10 years, because there what's called capital cost vintaging matters. That is the actual time it takes from the time where a cost changes to the time where you actually successfully build some new plant. And when you're talking about these very fast transitions like 9 years to 2030, it's not simply cost functions, but it's really the reality of what I think of as a derivative constraint, a constraint on the rate of how quickly we can build hardware and what the actual time delays are between when it's economically sensible to make the go decision on hardware and when that hardware is operational. And those time delays, that capital vintaging, really matters when you're talking about 2030.
I think Eisenhower's statement applies to the utility of energy system models, that his line of that plans are useless, but planning is essential. Yeah. And energy system models are fundamentally a tool for thought. And so understanding the consequences of assumptions is what energy system models are very good at. Predicting the future is not what they're good at.
Is that slightly more nuanced than the Václav Smil quote that I said at the top of the show? Energy forecasts are not worth even the cost of the cheapest acid paper on which they're printed.
I think the understanding that you can gain from using an energy system model in a thoughtful way is extremely valuable. If you just believe the numerical output blindly, then you're likely to be led astray.
And I think the time scale really matters, as Richard Toll pointed out in some of the comments, that if you're looking for relatively short time scales, you're looking at the relationship between some different costs. These are things that industry actively does, and there's no question there's forecast skill, and people use it for energy futures trading, no question. But that's really different from these questions of what happens in kind of 2050, which is outside the range of the way that the markets work.
Okay, Sara, you have a couple of thoughts, and let's get to another question.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I would put on my, improving energy models wish list. So one is along the lines of what Ken was saying is user model is actually just completely different way that policymakers and the public and the media interact with the models, not changing the models themselves at all, really. And then I think the second, more on the technical side, and this relates to some work that I'm doing, is thinking more about, how we model more of this disruptive change within these energy model systems, many of which are, were designed around in times when there wasn't such dramatic change, and more incorporation of like human elements and the interaction of the technology with society within the model. So trying to go beyond the cost. And of course, that's really complicated. And, it's not that we're going to start modeling people down to their individual behavior, but finding ways to better put that kind of behavior into our models.
Great. Okay, let's turn to Karen Spencer. You've got a question to do with Alberta, the energy sector, and getting oil and gas modelers together with climate modelers. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I love this discussion so far on the kinds of models here. And having worked within the energy sector for a number of years, I know that one of the major reasons I hear for pushback against a model is the big climate models have come out and said, in 100 years we'll be here. and there's a line that points up there, and it's the average of 800 runs of models. And many people within the oil and gas sector are very familiar with very detailed 3D gridded models, that take into account, again, physical systems, trying to model viscosity, permeability, and everything in an oil and gas system. This is the current field. If we drilled 18 infill wells and did a water flood, what would it look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years? And so really, again, short-term and long-term versus the cost to do that. And in doing that, they come up with the usefulness of their models and their potential strengths and weaknesses. Probably strongest by far in the first year to 5 years, weaker as we try and forecast into the future, farther into the future. So mine is not necessarily a question. It's just I'd love to set up a meeting between some of these people in the energy sector who are comfortable utilizing that type of modeling, meeting with someone like yourselves talking about the models behind this. Because what I see in the public eye is that one line from that climate model that says this is the trajectory we're headed on if we don't do this, is somewhat believed to be an exact, precise thing. And it's not. It's I consider it the first 5 years, what can we do to nudge that over a bit? And then I don't believe anything, 100 years in the future anyways. But just an observation. So very interesting.
Well, thanks, Karen. I want to open it up to David, Sara, and Ken, but my first reaction is surely that is already happening. And that meetings between the oil and gas or energy modelers locally and climate modelers, I'm a little gobsmacked that that's not happening. David.
Yeah. First of all, let me just say that I was in Eric, I'm spacing on his name, but at Penn State in the early 90s doing a postdoc. And there were people running paleoclimate models for where were paleo upwelling zones and potential oil. And the oil companies were very ready to use those model results to help them search for oil. So, the idea that I think there's motivated reasoning, and where climate models maybe pose a threat to your business, you don't like them, and where they can help you in your business, you do like them. And this is why I actually think, one of the things that David has worked a lot on, and I've worked on some also, that this question of geoengineering, I think is actually very good and nuclear power plays a similar role of getting through these kind of cultural tribes. And that, that most climate modelers don't like the idea of solar geoengineering, but it actually works very well in the climate model. So it's a clear case where, look, the people who developed these models didn't want it to conclude that solar geoengineering would basically work, but that's what the models seem to say. And I think that helps build trust in it. And similar things, when energy system modelers are not willing to put fossil fuels in their model, or they're not willing to put nuclear power in the model, and they just have solar and wind, and then energy system people come to this and say, well, what planet are you on? And so I think, anyway, David.
Yeah, I'll offer. So I was, appointed in chemical and petroleum engineering in Calgary for a while, and I actually did do reservoir modeling and climate modeling in some cases with the same people. I think, of course, those two talk. There's lots of overlap in numerical methods and so on. I think two things. One is when you talk about climate model projections of what will happen, those climate models don't do that. Climate models do that with an input, which is an assumption about what emissions are. Though that's not part of a climate model, it's an input to the model. That's this policy judgment about what will happen to CO2 emissions. And that's something where it's deeply uncertain in a very different way. But climate models do certainly have uncertainties. The uncertainties in sort of global temperature given CO2 are roughly a factor of 2 or a little more. They're quite big and they've been persistent. But I do think that if the question were sort of assuming there was no predictive skill a century out, I think we really know that's not true. I think what's so exciting is that we know it because we know it now from other planets. So we have real useful predictive skill for Mars, and we're starting to actually run these same climate models with the same code for exoplanets, including really weird exoplanets. And over the next decade or two, we'll start to get observations. So I think there's actually lots of ways in which we have confirmation of the model's predictive skill.
Yeah, and it's not only predicting historical trends, but also there's lots of detailed things about, how much radiation would you expect at this location at this time of the year, or, there's all kinds of numbers that are not observed that are predicted by the models that people go out and observe, and, either the model's consistent or not, but at least it's testable. And then also, people have run 1,000-year simulations, done paleoclimate, done Venus, done Mars. So anyway, I think while there's still uncertainty, there's a lot more scenario uncertainty, I think, than there is climate science uncertainty.
Yeah. Sara, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Karen, thanks for your comment. And it sort of sparked for something me that's kind of related, but which is we've been talking about, what matters is your assumption that goes into models. And we've been talking more about these computational models, but of course we all have our own mental models. And I do think that there are good examples of gaps in sort of those ingoing assumptions and mental models between people that come, say, from the oil and gas sector and from the renewable energy sector. That's one that I've observed. And it's not a matter of, one group being smarter than the other, but it's, what within the space that you've worked, what assumptions come out of that. And so to make that real, one example would be, the cost trajectory and cost trajectory improvements for renewable energy. One of the things that makes that, let's say, easier in a sense to do, if you're talking about, say, solar or wind, is that we are, at least at this point, we have so many places, so much of that resource out there. There's still so many good places to site these generators that your cost improvements are not fighting against a declining resource in the same way that they are within the oil and gas sector, where the oil producers have been sort of on this treadmill of basically having to improve their technology because they are emptying the easier to access oil fields. And so that leads to a very different experience where you're essentially, your technology improvements are always fighting against the declining resource quality, versus in the renewable energy space where in many cases you don't, I'm simplifying, but you don't have as much of that resource degradation. And so you see more of those improvements hitting the bottom line. And that's, neither side is wrong if you want, but it's very hard, I think, often to uncover those kinds of hidden assumptions because they're not even necessarily things that you're then writing down and putting into a model. But that can be really key for creating understanding across different groups.
Well, okay. I also see, for example, postdocs reluctant to put nuclear power in their model, and because I think there's a feeling that it could hurt your career academically if you get seen as pro-nuclear. It's and they're reluctant to do it.
Have they stopped putting nuclear fusion in models now? Like, have we written that off?
I don't think so. There was a big paper that came out recently, right, from the community that said, now we're really ready and it's getting closer. And I know it's kind of a joke, but part of me does, has some kind of belief that some of our improved computing power could ultimately result in kind of getting there. But I don't think it's completely written off, I guess.
Okay. At the risk of going overtime, a couple other things I want to ask, and folks, we might go a couple minutes overtime. Out of left field, this question may come out of left field. Is there any hangover from East Anglia Gate or Climate Gate? And for those who don't know, that was when climate science and modeling kind of got a kick in the pants in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. Server got hacked at East Anglia University, and some somewhat embarrassing emails were released alleging that climate scientists were kind of rigging results or rigging data or their models. Is there any hangover today in 2021?
My sense is that, there was this time when people were talking about the hiatus, and they were referring to the hottest decade in the last probably 1,000 years or so, if not more. And people saying, oh, well, the fact that this hottest decade had no significant upward slope during that decade was taken as evidence that climate change wasn't real. And I think this sort of email trove was released around the same time. But I think with the recent years being so warm, the idea that global warming isn't real, it's pretty much a fringe QAnon kind of belief at this point. I think that I don't think you can really enter into a serious discussion and maintain that humans don't influence the climate system.
Yeah, I think the cutting edge of what's politically hard are the questions of who wins and loses, and what are the real trade-offs of very deep emissions cuts versus other things we might do. I think I agree with Ken. I think it really is relegated to QAnon people who simply don't believe there's a problem. But I think now we're at the stage where there's I sometimes think that the climate community is like the dog that caught the truck. And suddenly now there really is political tension in the way in my sort of 30-year career, this is the first to have this level of political tension. But now the question is what actually happens in terms of how quickly emissions get driven down. And if we do make the wrong choices about where to allocate money in an effort in reducing emissions, and we don't see much, then we're going to have a political blowback.
I once had a debate with Nigel Lawson on, I think it was BBC or something. And before the debate, I told him, look, don't argue that the physics is wrong, because that's easy to argue against. Why don't you argue that people will be able to adapt and will deal with it? And that's much harder to argue against. But he decided to still argue on physics, which made it easier for me. But humans already live from the equator to the Arctic Circle, and it's really about sea level was 120 meters lower 20,000 years ago, and nobody's saying, oh, we need to restore the climate of 20,000 years ago. And so it's really a lot of it about pace of change and how fast can human civilization adapt to rates of change as well as natural ecosystems. And that's really unclear. And how to balance. And the other big issue is, for me, the big melting of the ice sheets. It's something like 60 meters of sea level rise over many thousands of years. But if we release lots of CO2 in the next decades and we don't do solar geoengineering or air capture, we're going to melt Antarctica. And that's thousands of years of sea level rise and losing basically every coastal city.
So I agree that on the whole, on the average, this is not a politically tenable view. I mean, of course, bringing this back to Alberta, we are sitting, David, and you and I and Ed, in one of the places where there is still a significant number of people who do hold that view. So I think that's just worth noting. But I agree that there is certainly that element of more of the debate is really happening around the, delay. So okay, there's a problem, but, let's deal with it later, or let's go slowly, or we can't do enough. And so, that is true, but, we're not as far from that here as the Canadian average or the North American average would suggest.
I live in San Francisco Bay Area, which is, politically fairly progressive. But we've been having a series of very warm and dry winters. Winters normally are a cool, rainy season. And a warm, dry winter means that you can go outside and go hiking in a t-shirt in February, and people like it. And people are going out and enjoying the weather. And the only what you see is signs in the Central Valley, because they're not getting enough water for their crops, but suburban people can pay more than farmers to water their lawns and so on. And so as long as people turn on the faucet and water comes out, basically nobody cares about droughts. And I think there's going to be aspects of global warming that people like. And I was also told that from somebody in Norway that the old people talk about how when I was a kid, there used to be snow on the ground and this and this. And the teenagers are just like, oh, there's granddad again going off about how things used to be a long time ago. And, I think, everybody acts like change is all bad. And I think a fair number of people are going to like some of the changes.
Right?
Yeah, that's a controversial topic, but one that we should unpack. Because
but not a lot of the world's poorest people in the hottest regions. I think evidence that high temperature really impacts people gets stronger every year. It's
absolutely. I mean, the mid-latitude equatorial states get screwed. Places like Canada get longer growing seasons. The one thing actually that I've been reading about in Canada is the number of deaths from people falling through ice is going up precipitously. They don't think it's just a factor of, people recreating on ice more. It's because ice is just getting thinner, and especially in shoulder seasons. Listen, we've gone longer than we ever have on an episode because the conversation was rich. Ken, thank you so much. Really grateful for the time. And we all learned a lot. So thanks very much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me, and sorry for interrupting people a few times.
No, that's part of it. That's what we do.
Okay.
Okay, closing comments. This episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com for reviewing as a podcast. Later, you can go to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Our next episode is on May 6th. It's going to be on heavy industries and how hard to decarbonize sectors with Thomas Koch-Blanc of RMI, who will be joining us from Sweden. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Rogers Communications, don't buy Shaw until it fixes the internet line in my neighborhood. Please make that a condition. And thanks as always to Mika McFarlane for your day of help, and to our very patient producer Eva Voinigescu. All right, that's a wrap, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.